Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Corona Crisis edition of Jesus to the Nations. My name is Dr. Matt Friedman, and I serve as professor and program director for intercultural studies at Kingswood University, and I also teach online for Asbury Theological Seminary in the U.S. Um, I'm going to be sharing today about millennial Islam and secularization, witness among the next generation of Muslims. And this is basically going to be a shortened version of the presentation that I was going to give at the conference itself. If you look on the website, you should be able to find my email address. And if anyone would like to get a copy of the full paper that this was actually originally based on, I would be happy to send that. So let's keep going. I'll give you a story. When I was, this was a few years ago, I was on a flight from Toronto to New York. And as the plane taxied down the runway and took off, I began conversing with my seatmate, who was a well-dressed man, appeared to be in his late 20s, early 30s, um, from a part of Asia with which I was already quite familiar. And as he introduced himself, and as we began to talk, he mentioned that he was from the Muslim community. And as we began to talk, and he was from a group that had a background in Islamic mysticism, which was something that I've done a lot of my own research and study on. So I was like, oh, this is going to be great. So I started looking for ways to kind of shape the conversation in such a way that would bring things around to the subject of Islamic mysticism and share how to understand who Jesus is in that context. But somewhere in the midst of the conversation, it took an unexpected turn for me. My new friend began describing his own readings. He said he'd been reading Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, and he was starting to wonder if there was anything or anyone out there at all. Well, this kind of blew my mind. I wasn't expecting this. I would expect this from an like secular Anglo person who had been in North America, whose family had been in North America for generations. I wasn't expecting this from a Muslim living in Canada. Not first generation, maybe second or third generation, but still, I wasn't expecting this. And what I began to realize as I mentally began integrating apologetics that I'd learned reading the writings of people like Alvin Plantinga, was that this gentleman was not only a Muslim of South Asian ancestry, but he was also an urban North American wrestling with many of the same issues of other faced by other people in his age group and professional status. Um, I was reminded too of an earlier time when I worked in South Asia myself. I was in South Asia for 18 years, working among people who spoke the Bengali language. And prior to my arrival, I'd understood that something of approaches to Muslim people. But when I began to enter into this society and integrate with and meet with and hang out with Bengali-speaking Muslim people, I had to come to grips with the fact that they were Muslims, but they were also Bengalis. They're not only Muslims. And I needed to tailor the way that I shared the gospel, the way I thought about what discipleship would look like. I needed to tailor that to the particular context in which I found myself. At the same time, I was reminded as well of one other story. This is again a few more years ago. I was previously teaching at another college in the United States, and I used to take my world religions students on kind of a world religions tour of various religious establishments in one of the nearby large cities. And um, we had gone, this was in 2012 in the state of Minnesota. It was just prior to the 2012 election. when Minnesota became the first state in the U.S. to approve same-sex marriage by popular vote. Prior to that, it had only been through court decisions. And there was a lot to observe and a lot to enjoy in our interaction at the mosque. But as we sat and listened to the message at the mosque, the message being preached at the mosque, it was pretty similar to messages which I suspect were also being preached that the following Sunday. This is on a Friday. It was similar to messages that I think would have been preached on the following Sunday at many churches in especially in Minnesota at that point. Concerns about that as society becomes more corrupted, it's important that youth in our community be given a solid grounding in the faith. And I was struck by the parallel concerns that the Muslim community and the evangelical Christian communities had for the upcoming generation regarding influences of secularization on society. So we're going to take a look at some of what secularization has looked like among Muslims in North America in the upcoming millennial and even Gen Z generations in North America. And I think this is going to be one of the reasons that this is so important to grasp is the fact that so often when we North American Christians have thought about Muslim people or discussed Muslim people, especially coming into North America, what we often tend to fall into is this idea that if we often fall into this idea that Muslims are the radicalization of Muslims in the West. I heard presentations in other parts of North America of people screaming about Muslims. They're all out to kill you and stuff like that, and stuff that I sought to counter at the time. But one of the things that I began to realize was in postmodern North America, especially not only as Muslim people come in, as they come in as university students oftentimes, but especially as their children are born and raised, and you have generations coming up in the North American context, they're absorbing a lot of the secularization that's part of the broader society. And we have to take that into account as we think about how we can approach Muslim youth today. Discussions that we've met on these issues of secularization among Muslims have been taking place among Muslims in the Muslim community as well. And some of those discussions involve those who wish to be faithful to their understanding of Muslim tradition. Others reflect those who more quietly choose to adapt a more hybrid-like progressive version of their faith, or to jettison it altogether. So you have a few well-known public figures who have pretty much discarded Islam altogether and come out as atheists. People like Ayaan Hirsi Ali from Somalia, or the novelist Salman Rushdie, ardently anti-religious. More recently, and that's what we have in this picture, Pakistani-American comedian Kunail Nanjiani. He produced this semi-autobiographical film called The Big Sick, which explores some of the borders of growing up Muslim in North America and rejecting the faith, even while retaining many cultural elements. There's also a stream of edgier, I might put it that way, sometimes punk and or pop culture-oriented Muslims of the sort represented by Michael Muhammad Knight's writing Muslim punk novel, The Taqwa Course, and his travelogues, Blue-Eyed Devil and Journey to the End of Islam. It's fascinating because the Muslim punk movement that is the center of the novel Taqwa Course did not actually exist before he published this novel. This novel sparked the beginning of this, but it speaks in part to the fact that there's a lot of Muslim youth who are like searching for meaning and searching for a way to somehow be authentically Muslim, yet in the North American context. So a recent essay on Muslim assimilation noted that U.S. Muslims, 60% of whom are under 40, are going through a process that's very American of finding new, diverse, self-constructed identities and faith. And this taqwa core, which is really just a small number, but it's one of a number of examples. Um, Parents of undergrads hope that their millennial children will focus in some level on the religious side of their identity, but focusing on figuring out the balance between their American self and their Muslim self, or their Canadian self and their Muslim self. But this sometimes goes in different ways. So, for example, there was an article by Emma Green in the Atlantic magazine entitled entitled "How America is Transforming Islam," and interviewed, for example, a young lady in her late 20s who is quoted as describing her own practice that she cares a lot about certain Muslim traditions like fasting on in the month of Ramadan, but she's not observant the rest of the year. And and um, and you even have a number of Muslims, again in this kind of age group, who would use something that will sound very familiar to anybody who's been in secular circles, where they would say, well, to say that someone's religious means you're very strict, focused on acts, and I'm very spiritual. I have a very strong faith in that kind of. Some of these, some observations of younger Muslims uh, who are raised in North America bring to my mind the insights of University of Notre Dame researcher, a sociologist named Christian Smith. Dr. Smith, he very famously wrote in about 11 years ago, published an article in which published a book in which he examined the spiritual lives of North American teenagers, and he concluded that what many of them believed, regardless of whether they were particularly Catholic or Jewish or Protestant, including many evangelicals, if you asked them to describe what they believed, it was not really the community, a reflection of the community that they came to. It was what he came to call moralistic therapeutic deism. And this seems to be at work in the Muslim community as well. So, on a recent visit to a mosque in the American Midwest, I briefly spoke to one of the main kind of liaison people at that mosque. I'll call him Ahmed, but that wasn't his real name. He was a Muslim man in his 30s, very circuitous backstory himself, kind of born and raised in the North America, and kind of became agnostic, married a lady from a Christian background who is just as nominal and agnostic as he was. Um, Later returned to Islam. That's why he was working at the mosque, of course. But it was really interesting that even his approach was very millennial friendly, full of disclaimers, very engaging, and a little bit of a model perhaps for how we should engage as well. I asked him how would I better understand this dynamic in Muslim North America, and he suggested there's two communities that have an online presence. One called the Ta'lif Collective, founded by a guy named Usama Khanun, and very kind of more progressive Islam type. The other is called the Yaqeen Institute, founded and led by a guy named Omar Suleiman, um, which there's a lot of articles on there. A lot of it is Muslim apologetics. This image is from their site. You look and it's about like sources of doubt in Islam. So how can they address these things that Muslim youth in North America are dealing with? They're actually thinking quite robustly about these things. Um, they're thinking about issues of sexual ethics, and sexual identity and gender identity. All these things are issues that are coming in. There are Muslim youth who identify as LGBTQ, and they're trying to figure out, what does this mean? Is this okay? Is this not okay? Is it something that we can address in a way that somehow reflects on our milieu? What about things like political alignments? How does that have a an impact on that? So for me, I'm looking at this, and the reality is we have a good deal in common in terms of concerns. But in the middle of these, it's worth asking, how do we address our Muslim friends of various stripes in a manner which will be engaging and ironic and loving? It might, to use the words of the late Lebanese pastor Fuad Akkad, enable us to build bridges of relationship which can bear the weight of the gospel. So in view of this, I want to offer one possible model from about 900 years ago. So not too recent. So one of my heroes and one of the earliest Europeans who was involved in reaching out to Muslim people as well as Jewish people was a Catalan-speaking Spanish man by the name of Ramon Llull. His surname is kind of funny. It's spelled Llull. And I found from a Catalan-speaking friend that the proper pronunciation is Llull. Now, sometimes he's called the first missionary to the Muslims. That's not true. There were Middle Eastern Christians reaching out to Muslims for hundreds of years before that. But he was actually really interesting because his approach involved apologetics and also a certain amount of kind of a mystical relational approach to the Muslim world and to Muslim people. But the interesting thing was even his apologetics was not, in contrast to many other figures of the day, wasn't kind of like attack Islam and rip it down type of an apologetics. Though he was capable of that, his approach was one of demonstrating the reality of the gospel through both logic and relationship and love and mysticism. His approach, kind of combining this mystical and rational, was there in a number of different books that he wrote, but one of the more accessible of those was something called the Book of the Gentile and the Three Wise Men. And it's interesting because it presents a picture of tolerance and interreligious dialogue in a way that inserts a robust apologetic for the Christian faith, but presents it in a way that isn't forceful. So it stood as in contrast to other things of the day. So in the book, there's a quote-unquote Gentile, a pagan basically, who's wandering through the woods, and he comes across a clearing in which three friends are walking together and talking together. One of them is a Jew, one is a Christian, one is a Muslim. And the fact that Llull has them walking together for a stroll shows that they're friends. They can be friends with one another. And the pagan man, the Gentile, he comes to them and he says, please, could you tell me? I know I need to find the true faith, the true religion. Could you tell me the true religion? And so Llull has them in turn present their faith. And what's interesting is when he has the Muslim figure present Islam, he doesn't have him present some straw man, fake version of Islam that can just be ripped down. He presents Islam very much like a Muslim of his day would have presented it. When the Jewish man presents Judaism, he presents it very much like a Jewish man of his day would have presented it. And when he presents the gospel, he presents it in a very convincing, again, logical, loving, mystical kind of way. And so what's interesting is at the end, so this goes on, this discussion goes on. And then finally at the end, the Gentile says, I've got it. I know who it is, which faith I'm going to follow, and I'm going to tell you all right now. And in the book, the three wise men say, well, please don't tell us. We don't want to know what your decision is, but we're going to regularly keep discussing our own faiths, and we don't want that to influence our discussion. Which is, at first, you read that and you're like, what the heck? And it's interesting because later on, somebody else asked Ramon Llull, they said, so who won? What did he actually come to believe? He said, well, obviously he became a Christian, but it was he presented it in such a way that it left it up to the reader, and with a kind of authenticity that I think many of our young people now would find very attractive. Um, but he's trying to be rhetorically neutral. So we can see how Yui was no stranger to controversy, right? But he actually said, instead of wanting, as one writer on him said, instead of wanting to deny the problems of lack of understanding or of violence, he has said simply, let us enter through another door, which is the door of his logic and his mysticism. So I think here he makes clear that his preference would be to engage the religious other in as peaceful and loving a manner as possible. And maybe this is a tool that we can use as we seek to share the good news of who Jesus really is with our Muslim friends, but especially the upcoming generation of Muslims, seeking to maybe integrate our knowledge of the Bible and even of Islam with an understanding that with both a means of discussion as well as a degree of knowledge about postmodern culture that will enable us to be effective in that context. Ordinarily, at this part in my presentation, I would have stopped and said, okay, well, let's take some questions. Let's break into group discussion, but we can't really do that in this context. But feel free to email me with any discussion points, any questions you would have, any additional points you would raise. This is obviously just really a thumbnail sketch. And again, if you have an opportunity to read the entire article that this presentation is based on, or it's in a book chapter in a book that was published by the Evangelical Missiological Society last year, then you'll get a little bit deeper flavor of what this is all about. Thanks so much for tuning in, for downloading, for listening to and watching my presentation online. I hope you had a good time and that you got something from it. And may God bless you as you seek to be a blessing to Muslims and to build bridges bridges of relationship that can bear the weight of the gospel, as that Pastor Fuad Khan mentioned and that I quoted earlier. Thank you. God bless.